There is a man standing in his kitchen at 11 at night, and his wife is crying 2 feet away from him, and he is not moving toward her. He is not moving away either. He is simply standing there present, watching her cry and saying nothing. And after almost a full minute of silence, she screams at him, "Why won't you fight with me? Why won't you even try?" And he says calmly, "Because I already know how this ends. I'm not going to perform an argument just so you feel like you won something." That man is not shut down. He is not numb. He has not stopped loving her. He has arrived somewhere most people spend their entire lives trying to reach and failing. If this is the first time you're hearing this described out loud, stay with me, because by the end of this video you may realize you already know someone like this, or you may realize quietly, uncomfortably, that you have become someone like this yourself. Before we go further, if content like this actually helps you make sense of yourself, hit like and subscribe, because it puts this in front of the people who are still searching for language for what they're going through. So let's talk about Sophia Stage, and let's be exact about what it is, because the internet has started using this phrase loosely, attaching it to anyone who seems calm or detached, and that is not what it means. Sophia is the ancient Greek word for wisdom, but not wisdom in the sense of knowing things. Wisdom in the sense of having survived things. It is not a personality trait. It is a residue. It is what is left over in a person after they have been hurt in the specific repetitive way that only deeply feeling people get hurt. And they have refused to become bitter, and they have refused to become numb, and instead they have become precise. Most conversations about sensitive people stop at the awakening stage, the moment someone realizes they feel more than the people around them, that they can sense a mood shift in a room before a single word is spoken, that they carry other people's stress home in their own body like it belongs to them. That stage gets a lot of attention online because it feels revolutionary the first time you name it, and it is real. But here is the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say directly. An empath who has only awakened, who has only named their sensitivity, is still enormously useful to people who want to use them. Naming a wound does not close it. It just means you can finally point to where it hurts. The awakened empath still adjusts their entire nervous system around whether other people are pleased with them. They have simply become conscious of doing it, which sometimes makes it worse, because now they feel guilty for something they cannot yet stop. That is not Sophia Stage. That is the middle of the journey, not the end of it. Across very different traditions, from Stoic philosophy to Buddhist practice to the clinical work of modern trauma researchers, there is a strange point of agreement about what happens to a person who goes deep enough into their own pain instead of running from it. The question they are asking themselves quietly shifts. It stops being, "Why does this keep happening to me?" and becomes something colder and more useful. What is this pattern actually trying to teach me? That shift sounds small when you say it out loud. It is not small. It is the difference between a person who is still auditioning for love and a person who has stopped auditioning entirely. In Sophia Stage, the sensitivity itself does not disappear. This is the part almost everyone gets wrong when they picture emotional maturity. They imagine numbness, a kind of protective callus that grows over the sensitive parts. The opposite is true. A person in Sophia Stage feels more accurately than they ever have. What disappears is not the feeling. What disappears is the automatic reaction to the feeling. Think of a sommelier tasting wine. They are not tasting less than an untrained drinker. They are tasting so precisely that they no longer need to react with a face, a comment, a reflex. They simply know what they are experiencing, and that knowledge is enough. The Sophia Stage empath walks into a family gathering and senses immediately which relative is performing happiness for the table, which sibling is silently furious, which parent is quietly grieving something nobody has named in years, and they hold all of that information without trying to fix a single piece of it, without absorbing it into their own chest, without turning it into their job to repair. This is where it becomes genuinely dangerous to certain people, and I want you to actually sit with what that danger means, because it is not danger in the way we normally use the word. A Sophia Stage empath cannot be reached through guilt. And guilt, if we are honest, is one of the oldest tools ever built for controlling someone who loves you. After everything I have done for you, I guess you just don't care the way I thought you did. These sentences are precision instruments, and they work devastatingly well on people who still believe their worth is measured by how much they give. But the Sophia Stage empath has done something almost nobody manages to do. They have quietly separated their worth from their willingness to perform devotion on command. They still love. They still show up. They still give generously to the people they have chosen. But none of it comes from fear anymore, and that single difference changes everything about how they can be reached and how they cannot, no matter how well the other person once knew exactly which single lever to pull. Watch what happens when someone who is used to controlling a room meets a Sophia Stage empath for the first time, because the reaction is almost always the same, and it tells you everything about who actually needs the old dynamic to survive. The manipulator tries the usual opening move: a little guilt, a little disappointment, a comment designed to make the empath feel like they have failed at being loving enough, and nothing happens. Not coldness, not a counterattack, just a kind of quiet attention, the empath watching the attempt land and simply not picking it up. To the manipulator, this is not peace, this is an emergency, because their entire relational toolkit was built for a different kind of person, someone whose sense of worth still depended on being seen as good, as giving, as endlessly patient. Remove that dependency and the toolkit stops working overnight. This is precisely why people who thrive on control so often describe emotionally healed people as cold, distant, or somehow changed for the worse. What they are actually describing is their own loss of access. Nothing about the empath became less loving. What became unavailable was the specific lever that used to guarantee compliance. There is a reason this particular transformation unsettles narcissistic personalities more than almost any other kind of change a person can make. Clinical work on narcissistic relational patterns consistently points to one structural fact: the dynamic depends entirely on the other person's fear of abandonment or hunger for approval. Remove both of those and there is nothing left to pull. Not because the empath has built a wall, but because they no longer need what the manipulator is offering. This is the part that gets mistaken for danger, and it deserves to be said plainly. The empath has not become aggressive. They have not become unkind. They have not launched into confrontation or revenge or even distance for its own sake. They have simply stopped performing the role that kept the old dynamic alive. And to someone who needed that role performed, stillness reads as an attack, even when nothing aggressive has actually happened. Consider what this looks like inside an actual relationship rather than an abstract description. A woman spends 9 years managing her partner's moods. She learns which comment will spiral into a 3-day silence. She learns to soften every disagreement before it becomes one, to apologize first even when she has done nothing wrong, simply to keep the peace intact. And for 9 years this works, in the sense that the relationship survives, though survival and health are not the same thing. Then something shifts quietly without an announcement. She stops softening, not out of anger, out of exhaustion that has finally turned into clarity. The next time her partner tries the same old comment, the one that used to guarantee 3 days of anxious repair work from her, she simply says, "That's your feeling to sit with," and goes back to what she was doing. Nothing about her tone changes, nothing about her face changes, and her partner is furious, not because she was cruel, but because for the first time in 9 years, the lever did not move anything. This is what makes Sophia Stage genuinely rare, because reaching it requires giving up something that most people are terrified to give up, which is the belief that if you just try hard enough, explain clearly enough, love generously enough, the other person will eventually see you the way you deserve to be seen. That belief feels noble while you are inside it. It does not feel like naivety. It feels like devotion, but it rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of how people actually change. People do not transform because they finally understand the impact of their behavior. People transform because something inside them decides to, on their own timeline, for their own reasons, and no amount of patient explanation from someone else can manufacture that decision. The Sophia Stage empath has finally absorbed this, not as bitterness, but as something closer to relief. This is why they stop over-explaining themselves in conflict. Not because they have given up on being understood, but because they have stopped building connection entirely out of their own effort, carrying both sides of a bridge that was only ever meant to be built together. There is something almost physical about the shift, and researchers studying nervous system regulation have documented a version of it that is worth understanding because it explains why Sophia Stage empaths are so difficult to destabilize. Emotional states are contagious between nervous systems in a very literal, measurable way. Spend enough time near someone who is anxious or reactive, and your own body begins to mirror that state. Your breathing shifts, your heart rate climbs, your thoughts start moving at their pace instead of your own. This is part of why early-stage empaths are so exhausted so often. They are not imagining the weight they carry, they are physiologically absorbing it. hour after hour, room after room. But something different happens in a nervous system that has done the deep, unglamorous work of integration, the kind that comes only from sitting inside old pain long enough to metabolize it instead of running from it. A regulated nervous system does not simply resist being pulled into chaos. It begins to have the opposite effect on the room around it. People unconsciously borrow the calm of the most regulated person present, the same way they once unconsciously borrowed the anxiety of the most dysregulated one. Sophia Stage empaths do this without trying, without performing serenity for an audience. Their steadiness becomes a kind of gravity, pulling the room towards stillness instead of being pulled toward panic. And this single quality is what makes them both remarkably good to be near and remarkably difficult for anyone who is invested in keeping the old chaos alive to ever fully control again. No matter what they try. Nobody arrives at Sophia Stage by reading the right book at the right time, and this is worth saying clearly because a lot of content online implies otherwise, as if enough insight or the right morning routine could shortcut you there. It cannot. There is no shortcut, no seminar, no single breakthrough conversation that installs it permanently, because the thing being built here is not knowledge at all. It is tolerance, plain and simple, hard won. Specifically, the tolerance to stay inside your own pain long enough to understand exactly what it is pointing to, instead of doing what almost everyone does instinctively, which is flinch away from it the moment it becomes uncomfortable. Most people spend their entire lives managing pain instead of metabolizing it. They distract from it, they explain it away, they find a new relationship or a new project or a new belief system that lets them avoid sitting with the actual specific thing that hurts. And distraction works for a while. It works until the same pattern shows up again in a different costume, with a different name attached to it, asking the exact same question it asked the last time. Reaching Sophia Stage requires finally answering that question instead of running from it one more time. Consider a specific and common version of this. A man in his late 30s keeps ending up in friendships where he is the one who initiates every plan, remembers every birthday, shows up during every crisis, and receives almost none of that in return. For years, he tells himself this is simply his personality, that he is naturally a giver, that his friends are just busy, that it evens out eventually, even though it never actually does. Then, after one particular friend disappears the moment he needs support himself, something shifts that no amount of previous disappointment had managed to shift, not because this betrayal was worse than the others. Often it is not even the worst one. It is simply the one that finally lands on ground that has been prepared by every version that came before it. He does not become bitter about friendship in general. That would be the early stage response. The wound still raw, still generalizing outward, still afraid. What happens instead is more precise. He starts asking a different question entirely. Not why do my friends always take more than they give, which keeps him focused on other people's behavior and his own bad luck, but what have I been organizing my sense of worth around this entire time? That single reframe is the actual mechanism of Sophia Stage, and it explains why the process cannot be rushed or faked. You cannot think your way into asking that question honestly. You have to be hurt enough times, specifically enough, to finally stop protecting the version of the pattern that lets you avoid asking it. This is also why the word dangerous gets attached to people who reach this stage, and the word deserves real scrutiny rather than being accepted at face value. Dangerous to whom exactly? Not dangerous to people who genuinely love the empath, because those relationships tend to deepen once the empath stops performing constant availability and starts showing up from genuine choice instead of quiet fear. The word dangerous almost always comes from someone who benefited specifically from the earlier, more exhausted version. The friend who never had to reciprocate because the empath never asked them to. The partner who never had to regulate their own moods because the empath absorbed the fallout every time. The family member who never had to apologize because the empath always found a way to forgive first, quietly, without ever being asked to. To that person, growth genuinely does look like a threat, because it removes the exact conditions that made the old relationship comfortable for them specifically. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes an accusation that gets thrown at emotionally healed people constantly. When someone tells a Sophia Stage empath that they have become cold, distant, or somehow less loving than they used to be, that statement is rarely about the empath's actual behavior. It is a diagnostic tool, whether the person saying it realizes this or not. It tells you precisely what that relationship required from the empath in order to function, and it tells you that requirement is no longer being met. A healthy relationship does not experience someone else's boundaries as an attack. Only a relationship that was quietly depending on the absence of those boundaries experiences their arrival as a loss. There is a specific kind of clarity that comes with recognizing this pattern in your own life, and it does not feel like triumph, at least not at first. It feels closer to grief because seeing clearly means finally seeing how many relationships were built on an imbalance you spent years calling love, simply because you had never experienced the alternative and had no comparison point to measure it against. That grief is part of the process, not a detour from it. You cannot skip the mourning and arrive at the clarity intact. The empath who reaches Sophia Stage is not searching anymore for the right audience to finally be vulnerable with, waiting for someone who will finally receive their openness the way they always hoped someone eventually would. They have stopped making their openness conditional on finding that perfect recipient. Instead, they are simply themselves, consistently, without adjusting the performance depending on who is in the room, and they let that consistency do the sorting for them naturally. The people who can only tolerate the earlier, more anxious version drift away on their own, without confrontation, without a dramatic conversation, simply because the dynamic that kept them close no longer exists to hold them there, and its absence alone is enough to send them looking elsewhere for what they used to take from this person without ever once having to ask for it directly. There is one more thing about Sophia Stage that almost nobody talks about because it does not fit the narrative of triumph that these kinds of videos usually end on, and it deserves to be said honestly instead of dressed up. Reaching this stage does not mean the pain disappears. It does not mean old wounds stop existing or that certain memories stop carrying weight when they surface unexpectedly on an ordinary afternoon. What changes is your relationship to that weight. Early on, pain arrives and takes over, rewriting your entire day, your mood, sometimes your sense of who you are for hours or weeks at a time. In Sophia Stage, pain still arrives, but it arrives as a visitor rather than an occupier. You notice it, you let it sit with you for exactly as long as it needs to, and then, without forcing anything, it moves on, and so do you, carrying a little more understanding than you had before it showed up. This is not the same as being unaffected. People sometimes confuse the two, and the confusion is understandable because from the outside they can look identical, but unaffected is a wall. What we are describing here is a floor, something solid enough to hold weight without collapsing, without needing to build a wall in the first place. That difference matters more than it sounds like it should, because a wall keeps everyone out indiscriminately, the people who deserve access along with the people who never did. A floor simply holds you steady while you decide, consciously, who gets access and who does not, based on actual evidence rather than fear. This is why Sophia Stage empaths are often described as warmer, not colder, by the people who actually know them well. Their love has not diminished. It has simply stopped being available on demand to anyone who asks for it, regardless of whether that person has ever shown up in return. There is a kind of freedom in this that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it yet, and easy to misunderstand from the outside as detachment. It is not detachment. It is the end of a very specific kind of exhausting labor, the labor of trying to earn safety by proving your worth over and over to people who were never actually going to be moved by the proof, no matter how much of it you produced. When that labor finally stops, what is left underneath it is not emptiness. It is capacity to actually be present with the people who have earned it, instead of spending that same energy auditioning for people who never intended to give you a fair hearing in the first place. So here's the question worth sitting with honestly, not as something to answer quickly in your head and move on from, but as something to actually turn over for a moment before you keep scrolling. Where are you right now, specifically, not where you wish you were? Not the version of yourself you perform on good days. Are you still explaining yourself to people who have already decided not to listen? Are you still hoping that if you just say it the right way one more time with the right words in the right order, someone will finally understand you the way you have always wanted to be understood? Or have you already started to notice the shift, the quiet moments where something that used to devastate you barely registers anymore? Where you catch yourself staying calm in a conversation that would have wrecked you a year ago, and you are not entirely sure how you got here, together, only that something clearly moved. Every stage in this process has its own gift and its own particular kind of difficulty, and there is no shortcut past any of them, no matter how much a title or a thumbnail promises otherwise. The empaths who eventually arrive at Sophia Stage do not skip the earlier chapters. They live through every single one of them, the absorbing, the exhaustion, the slow realization, the specific betrayal that finally breaks the pattern open, and only then, on the other side of all of it, the stillness that so many people mistake for something cold when it is actually the opposite. If any part of this describes something you recognize, either in yourself or in someone you love, or someone you have finally had to release, tell me honestly in the comments what the last 6 months have actually looked like for you emotionally. Not the version you would tell a coworker who asked how you were doing in passing. The real version. What did you learn about yourself that you did not expect to learn? What pattern finally broke and what finally broke it? These comment sections consistently turn into some of the most honest writing anywhere on this platform, more honest than most conversations people have out loud with the people closest to them. And I read every single one because this is exactly the kind of thing that becomes easier to say to strangers first before it becomes possible to say to the people who actually need to hear it from you directly. Wherever you are in this process right now, you are not behind, and you are not too sensitive, and you are not broken for having taken this long to get here. You were simply doing the only thing that was ever actually available to you, staying inside something difficult until it finally taught you what it came to teach. And that is not weakness in any sense of the word. That is exactly how Sophia Stage gets built, one uncomfortable, unglamorous, honest moment at a time. And if you are only now noticing it happening inside you, that simply means your own moment has finally arrived, quietly, the way it always does, without an announcement, without applause. Simply and undeniably, finally quite true.